Love is like a blessing from the king's only love. Can bring the healing from the queen. Love is like a blessing from the king's only love. Can bring the healing from the queen.
In this Black Mestory series, we take an in-depth look at the region of West Africa, defined in a broad context as being as far north as Mauritania and as far east as Chad, with the Central African Republic and the southeast curving into Cameroon. In this, the third part of our series on West Africa, we look at what was happening across the whole of this region between 1000 and 1500 CE, following on from what we covered in part 2 of this series when we looked at West Africa in the first millennium of the Common Era. As we discussed in part 2, the establishment of large and powerful kingdoms and empires across the whole of the sub-Saharan West African region throughout this period was a major development, especially after the arrival of the Arabs coming down into the Sahara region from the north coast around 700 of the Common Era. The formation of these empires was generally connected to a desire to do trade and military defense. Slave raids to meet the Arabs' demand for slave stock and the growth of the Islamic faith which they brought with them also drove waves of migration into the formerly uninhabited forest lands of the south. The ancient Ghana Empire, which had been the first of the great states to be formed in West Africa around 200 of the Common Era, had started to go into decline after the start of the second millennium, when it started to experience significant levels of migration out of the territory that it controlled. By 1100 CE, the Soso Kingdom had formed in the territory in modern-day Guinea, taking control of land that had been in the possession of the Ghana Empire. Further north, in modern-day Mauritania, there was a heavy Arab and Muslim influence developing, which may also have contributed to the decline happening in relation to the Ghana Empire, as the new faith continued to take hold among many of its people who were eager to benefit from trade with the Arabs. The situation for the empire would continue to dip on a downward spiral as yet more migration would occur, with large numbers of people heading southwest towards the uninhabited forests of modern-day Sierra Leone and Liberia, accompanied by the gradual expansion of the Soso Kingdom into present-day Mali. On the east of the West African region, the traditionalist divine ruler of the Kanem Empire converted to the Islamic faith, effectively making his empire a Muslim state and boosting their opportunity to make further profit on the Saharan trade route leading up to the Libyan coast. The Hausa Kingdom in northern Nigeria also saw conversion to Islam in its territory. As with the other kingdoms taking similar steps, they were able to benefit by increasing their trading opportunities with Arab merchants and their agents in doing so. Migration taking place during this period into the uninhabited forests of modern-day Benin from southern Togo would have been triggered by the slave raiding activities of the Akan, who were based in the neighbouring territory of present-day Ghana. The capture of slaves, making up at least a small portion of the trade that the Akan were doing, whether directly or indirectly, with the Arab merchants located further north towards the trade routes. The following century would see the emergence of the Mali Empire, taking over from what was the remnants of the Ghana Empire and seeing the Muslim religion become prominent among its people. By 1300 CE, it had also conquered the Takra Kingdom in Senegal and expanded its influence into the northern part of present-day Ivory Coast, causing a wave of migration by the people there further south into the dense forest and away from the Islam faith being imposed on them. But the Mali Empire would go into decline by 1400 CE as the Songhai Empire took its place in Mali and in Ivory Coast. This new authority would drive another wave of migration in Ivory Coast into its southern territories. The decline of the Mali Empire would also see the establishment of the Jolof Empire in Senegal. On the eastern side of the West African region, the Kanem Empire had been significantly weakened by battle with the Soul civilization, which was based in northern Cameroon, and ended up retreating from its locations in Chad into its territory on the western side of the lake on its southwest border, forming what would become the Bonu Empire. The Soul civilization will go into decline from its base in northern Cameroon by 1450, being replaced by the Kotoko Kingdom. Around this time, Portuguese explorers were making their first appearance on the West African coast, making their way south along the coastline from Morocco in search of a new route to India and arriving at Mauritania and Senegal. The Portuguese had been aware through past trading on the north coast that sources of gold were located further south beyond the desert, and took this opportunity to see what possibilities might be of getting a more direct link to the actual source, bypassing what they perceived to be corrupt more middlemen. Unable to get the kind of gold returns that they had desired, they turned their attention to other products, including for slaves. A decade later, they arrived at the place they called the Lioness Mountains, Sierra Leone, and then Liberia, which they named the Pepper Coast. By 1470, they had made it round to present-day Ghana and established a trading relationship with the Akan Kingdom there. It can be seen as no coincidence that the Akan relocated further south into the forest during this period to be closer to their gold fields, redirecting their main trading focus away from the Arab merchants on the trade routes in the north and towards the Europeans on the southern coastline. It is interesting to note that when the Portuguese arrived at their next location, neighbouring Togo, they would build a small fort there, identifying that area as the Slave Coast. It is very likely that it was their contact with the Akan that encouraged them to name it in this way, taking into consideration that the Portuguese had been collecting slaves from all of the locations on the West African coast where they had made contact with Africans. The Akan, who would already have seen the people of Togo as being a source for the capture of prisoners for the sale as slaves, may have encouraged the Portuguese to see these people as being the ideal slave stock. The Akan-Portuguese trading relationship would continue to grow, seeing the Portuguese establish a trading post off the Ghana coast around 1480, inevitably involving not only gold but also slaves. This would lead to a subgroup within the Asante Confederation of the Akan called the Abran, migrating west into present-day Ivory Coast. These people would probably have been seen as an inferior sect within their confederation by the Asante nobles and leadership, and may therefore have been vulnerable to being condemned to being sold into slavery for the greater good of the whole nation. By 1500, the Portuguese, having already made it all the way around the continent and onto India, began setting up further bases on the West African coast at Guinea and Cameroon for the purpose of intensifying their business in the capture of prisoners for transportation to the slave states being developed in the Americas. Ships from other European nations would also start to arrive with the intention of benefiting from the trade in African slaves. Further north in Cameroon, the Mandora Kingdom was formed in the once volcanic Mandora Mountains, from where they hoped to be able to develop into a strong nation. The nearby Bornu Empire in northeast Nigeria had been growing in strength and was successful in taking its former territory back in Chad. It would appear that they then began entering into slave raiding activity in Central African Republic for its trading activity on the Arab-influenced slave markets further north. In summary, without doubt, the most notable occurrence in West Africa in the first half of the second millennium was the spread of the Islamic faith across most of the West African region. Apart from small pockets elsewhere, the southern third of the identified West African region was the only part where African traditionalist culture and religious rites remained prominent. The religion that the Arabs brought with them began gaining some popularity amongst many nobles, chiefs and kings through the influence that the Arab merchants and their agents on the trade routes were able to wield, particularly in relation to the potential for trading profits. The arrival of Portuguese explorers around the coast of the West African region, approaching the end of the first half of the second millennium, would also be a notable occurrence, leading into the start of the European-led transatlantic slave trade.
Love is like a blessing from the King's only love can bring the healing from the Queen's love. Is like a blessing from the King's only love can bring the healing from the Queen.